Story 1. Whispers of the Forgotten. The wind howled through the ancient graveyard as Daniel stepped carefully over the cracked tombstones. His friends had dared him to spend an hour inside the old cemetery, but now, alone in the dark, he regretted accepting the challenge. A full moon bathed the graves in an eerie glow, casting long, twisted shadows. The air was thick with decay, the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves clinging to his skin. Then a whisper slithered through the night. "Daniel," he froze. The voice was brittle, rasping like dry leaves. His breath hitched as he spun around, but there was nothing, only rows of weathered tombstones, their names long worn away by time. A soft shuffling came from behind a nearby crypt. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. "Why did you come here?" The whisper returned, closer this time. Daniel turned and ran, his feet stumbling over uneven ground. The graveyard seemed endless, the entrance nowhere in sight. Then the earth shifted beneath him. A skeletal hand burst from the dirt, seizing his ankle. He screamed, kicking wildly, but more hands emerged, fingers curling around his limbs. The ground yawned open, pulling him down into the cold embrace of the dead. As he sank into the grave, the last thing he saw was a tombstone, his own name carved into it. Then silence. The wind carried only the echoes of his final scream, and the graveyard went still once more. Story 2. The Last Rite. Ever since he was a child, Ben had passed by the old graveyard at the edge of town. He always thought it was just an old, forgotten place. The graves were weathered, the iron gates rusted, and the stones leaned at odd angles. There was a particular stone, though, that always stood out to him. It was different, newer, well-maintained. It was the grave of a man he didn't know. One evening after a long day at work, Ben decided to take a walk through the graveyard. He'd never been inside before, but something about it tugged at him. Perhaps it was the eerie quiet or the weight of all the forgotten souls, but his curiosity got the best of him. He wandered deeper into the cemetery, but as he passed the gravestones, a strange sensation gnawed at him, like he was being watched. He turned to look but saw nothing but shadows. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. As he walked, he found himself drawn to the mysterious grave. The name on the stone was Thomas Marchand. Ben had never heard of him. The date was recent, but something felt off. Something about the letters on the stone didn't sit right. It looked too fresh. Ben reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the surface. That's when the ground beneath him shuddered. He stepped back, startled, but there was no sound, no falling earth, just a sharp crack from the grave itself. Then he heard it, a low, guttural voice from within the stone. "You shouldn't have touched it." Ben stumbled back, his pulse racing, but the voice didn't stop. It was almost pleading. "You're next." He turned and began to run, heart pounding. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had to get away from the grave. But the cemetery was different now. The paths were no longer familiar. The gravestones shifted as he passed, blocking his way. The fog that had rolled in felt like hands reaching out to trap him. He stumbled toward the gates, but when he reached them, he found they were locked. The metal rattled violently in his hands as if resisting him, as if it didn't want him to leave. He turned around trying to shake the terror off, but there, at the edge of the cemetery, standing still and staring at him, was the figure of Thomas Marchand. His skin was pale, his eyes black voids, and in his hand, he held Ben's own ID. "Welcome to your final resting place." Ben tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't open. His vision blurred, and his body felt frozen in place. As the fog thickened around him, he realized with chilling clarity, he was no longer in control. And then the figure stepped forward. Story 3. The Wrong Grave. Jake wasn't supposed to be in the graveyard that night, but a bet was a bet. His friends dared him to take a selfie inside Black Willow Cemetery, the one place everyone avoided after dark. Simple enough. Get in, snap a pic, get out. The wind howled as he stepped past the tombstones, his phone flashlight barely cutting through the mist. He found an old grave with a large, cracked tombstone. Perfect. He raised his phone, flipped to selfie mode, and froze. Behind him, in the screen's reflection, stood a man. Not just any man. Him. Jake's breath hitched. His reflection wasn't just delayed. It wasn't him at all. The face was gaunt, the skin grayish and sunken. The eyes were hollow, and worst of all, the reflection was smiling. He spun around. Nothing there. His chest tightened. Maybe it was a glitch. He flipped the camera back on. Now the reflection was closer. He dropped the phone and bolted. His legs burned as he sprinted for the entrance. But the tombstones, they were different now. Older, the names unfamiliar. The gate was missing. The cemetery stretched endlessly in all directions. His stomach twisted as he turned back to the tombstone he had stood by. His breath caught in his throat. It had his name on it. Date of death, tonight. A cold hand touched his shoulder. A whisper rasped in his ear. You were never supposed to leave. He turned to scream, but his voice was gone. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His body felt numb, as if the graveyard itself was swallowing him whole. And then everything went silent.